and studied relics in church history, and profoundly impacts many who encounter its mystery.
As a person of faith, looking at it through the eyes of faith, I don't think it can help but touch your heart.
Something that we can look on not only to bolster our faith in those moments of weakness, but also to deepen our faith and our appreciation, our intimacy with Christ.
Join Fiat Ministry Network and Patchwork Heart Ministry as they examine the science of the shroud through the lens of faith.
Really interesting scientific information that we didn't know about, like the pollen from all the different regions of the world. As the shroud traveled around, it picked that up. Some of the mites, things like that was really interesting to me. I mean, this made you really want to believe it a lot more.
It's impressive. Like, humanly, I don't think that is another level of love. It's not I'm gonna see people like, oh, I love you, I'll give you a chocolate. No. I'm giving you more than my life. I'm giving you my suffering.
Asking both experts and disciples, who do you say I am?
As far as who the man of the shroud is, as a person of faith and kind of reviewing the evidence there, it seems that a convincing argument can be made that it's Jesus of Nazareth.
Visit patchworkheart.org/shroud to learn more and get exclusive behind-the-scenes updates for your support.
The St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, in partnership with Patchwork Heart Ministry and Fiat Ministry Network, presents a podcast for families in crisis.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith podcast. This is our podcast on the saints. It's 10 saint series for our Families in Crisis series. Our website, of course, is nonnatus.org, and I want to welcome our board president, Mickey Kelly. Thanks for joining us, Mickey.
Hi, and thank you for having me. And I have to say, I am very excited about this episode for the podcast series on the saints for families in crisis.
I am too. And I have to say that it was your idea, and a wonderful idea that was inspired by the Holy Spirit, when you suggested that we do this one on John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, John Paul the Great. And there's so much to unpack when we think about some of the things that he said and prayed about and wrote about having to do with families, and even, families that are in crisis situations. And so I'm just going to turn it over to you, Mickey. And, maybe you can start out with telling us, what gave you the inspiration for this podcast to, decide on this one? Because I just think this was a wonderful selection on your part.
Yeah. So, and I'll be honest, I felt like St. John Paul the Great, he really relates to the families in crisis, because before he was, before he entered religious life, for one reason. One is that he saw firsthand what it was like to lose a family member. He lost his mom when he was just 9 years old, almost 9 years old. And then later down the road, say right around when Nazi occupied Poland, his father died. And then, of course, his siblings would die at some point, in between. And then, of course, he would eventually become a priest. But then when, Nazism fall, that, of course, gave way to communism, he still managed to be, the Pope for the family, I would like to call it. In fact, he even instituted, and I think this may not shock any of us, but he started in 1994 the World Meeting of Families, which, of course, we had it years ago, and that actually inspired many of us to set up the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation. And personally, and honestly, if we're going to do a series on saints for families, why not St. John Paul the Great? And he has a myriad of quotes that relate to the family. And I'm sure we're going to unpack some of them. Well, maybe not all of them, but we're going to unpack, maybe some of the most important ones, that I think is very, that really relates to what we're going through right now. It's particularly, and it's very fitting that this podcast episode airs in October. It's Respect Life Month. It also airs on his feast month. It also coincides with the fact that he became our Holy Father this month back in the late 1970s, succeeding Pope John Paul I, who only lasted about a month, So, and I'm sure you may remember that very well too when you were growing up.
Yeah, I absolutely do, because I don't have the date right in front of me, but as you said, late 70s is when he became Pope, and late 70s I was a middle teenager, around 13 or 14 years old. So of course I do remember that, and it was a pretty big deal because John Paul the first, as you said, he passed away, and I don't even think he was Pope for a month. I think it was a very short period of time. Maybe before the end of the podcast, I'll look that one up and just confirm it. But Mickey,
Actually,
thanks for
and it was 1978.
78.
So that's a very interesting year for my family remembered it quite well. So
Yeah, it's a memory that does come to mind because it was honestly, it was a huge thing. It was a very, very big thing. And this was long before social media, long before even the internet. And so everything was TV. We found out about everything through radio, TV, and newspapers and magazines, print media. But I definitely do remember it all over the place that, we have a new Pope, and the first one, John Paul I, died so quickly. But I just want to commend you on, again, this idea to make John Paul II one of our 10 saints for the series. It's kind of hard to pick 10 saints that represent families in crisis, because we wanted to stay in that whole realm of like the charism for our foundation. Of course, our foundation is a Mercedarian ministry, and the fourth vow to our religious order is the willingness to give our lives for those in danger of losing their faith. And of course, one of those ways that we give our lives is just through something like what we're doing right now, by offering our prayers, our care, our outreach, and even communicating in a way just like we are now in this podcast, in trying to make outreach to you who might be listening and may be going through some kind of a challenge or an adversity, either personally or in your family. I thought I'd just start this out with one of those quotes from John Paul II, Pope John Paul II. He says, "To maintain a joyful family requires much from both the parents and the children. Each member of the family has to become, in a special way, the servant of others." From St. John Paul II. Let's talk about that, Mickey. I mean, he was really big into teaching and catechizing people. And I think this statement that he's making is saying that if you want to be a successful family, that you have to learn how to serve.
Oh, of course, Anne. Of course. I think you may know what he's talking about very well, because, because of course, well, you're a parent as well. And of course, but for you and me, we kind of see it firsthand with how our parents tend to serve, our needs. When we were like little, when we were rugrats, they would change our diapers, make sure we got to bed, make sure we took a nap, this, that, and everything, make sure we got our clothes on, things like that. And then there were times, and it's not just necessarily like the corporal aspect of, our needs, but there's also the spiritual. And of course, St. John Paul the Great, when I look at him, I always thought he was like a spiritual father to so many people. My best friend, who is actually half Polish, she thought of St. John Paul the Great as her spiritual godfather, because she loves St. John Paul the Great no matter what it is, and her face lights up every time she's engaging in a conversation when they talk about his life and what have you. And then of course, you want to know the spiritual godmother, it would be a fellow Pole of St. John Paul the Great, and that is St. Faustina, who gave us, the very beautiful Divine Mercy Chaplet. And of course, the image of Divine Mercy. But that's a bit of a side note right there, but they go back to the main point. And truthfully, like, I kind of see firsthand, like, I've seen that how my parents, would serve me, like, whether it's like getting me, like, food. Like, if you think about, like, when you're taught, like, when you're a little baby, like, you have like the mom or the dad, like, feeding you. And I mean, you had kind of came full circle, I'm sure, for you, and when your daughters were growing up. And and of course I kind of saw that, with my two older siblings when they became parents, when they had to, put the little spoon in the kid's mouth, to give them baby food or whatever the case is. And the spiritual aspect would be also, especially for the dads that are listening to this, you have to bring your kids to the faith, raise them to be, faithful Catholic citizens, not of this world, but for the next. Teach them how to pray the rosary, teach them how to pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet, make sure they get into mass every morning, leading them to, like, lead the rosary, family rosary at night, or even just, helping them, say the prayers in the morning, and even, like, leading grace before meals when having family time during dinner. Those things right there, as you mentioned, those are the things that help, that teaches us how to serve not just the community, but how to serve our family.
Yeah, really great points. And I also like how you reference your own family and even watching like your sister and your, other family members that have children, and developing relationships within their own families, and how God can work there, right? And I think what John Paul II is saying about being a servant is that, the servanthood isn't just for the religious or the priest, right? We're being like Mother Teresa out there in Calcutta. It can happen right in our own homes, right? We can serve people, our husbands, wives, children, neighbors, things like that. So I think that he's always drawing us to serve. I do have another quote that I wanted to read, and it says that marriage is an act of the will that signifies and involves a mutual gift, which unites the spouses and binds them to their eventual souls, with whom they make up a soul family, a domestic church. So that's one of his quotes. And it also reminds me, when I read that about marriage, is that, I mean, of course, when I think of John Paul II, and I think when you do too, I think of theology of the body. I don't think we can get around not mentioning that, because it was such a huge part, a huge writing that he did, although he wrote so many encyclicals and writings that we could spend probably several podcasts talking about all of his writings. But I definitely think we should talk about that. And I will just say that for me, when I read Christopher West's Theology of the Body and learned about what it is, what it means, and it was all based on John Paul II's writings, it opened up a whole new world for me to understand how we are body and soul, and how everything that we do is sacramental. So I don't know if Mickey, you want to speak on theology of the body a little bit.
Yes, and I feel like there's been quite a bit of, evangelism in the Catholic Church today that are big promoters of or also I should say heavy hitters and promoters for the theology of the body. You look at Damon Owens, the Everts, there's a really a whole list. Even Edward Shree, who I believe teaches at Benedictine College, or I might get fact checked on this one, but that's okay. Because I know he went there, and I think he taught there at some point. Most likely, he probably teach with the Augustine Institute. But the bottom line is this. This is like I think the metamorphically speaking, theology of the body, which was one of the most recognizable works of St. John Paul the Great, it could be likened to a general secret weapon Now, I'm not saying this was a weapon that's going to cause destruction or anything, but for St. John Paul the Great, the theology of the body writings was actually going to be a weapon for, a weapon that would promote love and, promote the, as you said, the will of the other. And St. John Paul the Great, he also, for most of his papacy, he focused on life and family. And I'm not just saying like, against abortion, but he did, spoke out against other issues like, the death penalty, the capital punishment, even unjust wars. And also, like, when it came to the family, like I mentioned earlier about the World Meeting of Families, without this, every 3-year gathering or whenever it's happening, we wouldn't have, that it wouldn't have been here in Philadelphia back in 2015. And without it, I don't think the foundation would have ever existed. I mean, it could have existed another way, but without the World Meeting of Families, I don't think we would have existed. And he does talk a great deal about the domestic church. And it's not just like, you go to church every given Sunday and you're surrounded by people from all walks of life. But the domestic church that St. John Paul the Great reminds us is the family. And the family is what keeps society glued together. But of course, as we look at today with the recent headlines, we see that families are falling apart. Half Catholic marriages are ended up being divorced. You also have, people misusing sex. Well, the abortion, debate just got sent back to the states, in light of the Dobbs decision that happened back in June of 2022. And we also see that, human dignity is attacked spiritually and even physically. And I think part of the reason is because of, families, parents not teaching their kids what is right and what is wrong. Some people seem to forget or take for granted that parents are the first teachers. They have to teach their kids what is right and wrong. That the simple things, please, thank you, excuse me, I'm sorry. Things like that. And there are things that dads can teach their kids, and there are things that a mom can teach. But together, I think of it as a powerful force to help these kids when they grow up to take on these lessons and apply it. And, it's a cycle. Parents, they teach their kids grow up, they teach their kids. And let's face it too. Pope Francis even said something about, grandparents being a reservoir of wisdom. Or, of course, elderly people, of course. And there's something grandparents can teach, not just their kids. And oftentimes too, maybe like, bust their chops in front of in front of their grandkids so they can get a chuckle. But there are some things that maybe the parents are not teaching their kids that their grandparents want to implement, in their upbringing. So overall, it's important for parents to understand that they're the first teachers. It's not when they drop them off to a neighborhood school or whatever and say, have a great day. And then, maybe they don't learn anything, or maybe they don't really, take in their education. But parents, their first role is to be teachers of not just of life lessons, but also the faith.
Mickey, thank you so much. You really said so much during that period. I'm grateful to you because there's a lot for me to also respond to in a really positive way. I mean, the first thing, what you just said about grandparents, I couldn't agree more. And the Holy Father, Pope Francis, did make a statement about that. So I encourage our listeners to, maybe research that a little bit about what Pope Francis has said about the importance of the role, the spiritual role of grandparents, and how young people, old people, people in the middle all make a difference in the family. They all have an equal importance. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And backing up to theology of the body, I have a quote here from Christopher West, and he says that brace yourselves if we take in what the Holy Father, and he's referring to Pope John Paul II, is saying in his theology of the body, we will never view ourselves, view others, view the church, the sacraments, grace, God, heaven, marriage, the celibate vocation. We will never view the world the same again. And I think it's important for us to hear those words. You know, Christopher West, we do have to give him a little credit too, is that he really did help to bring theology of the body to life for, you know, common people who might not understand really super deep theology. Because I think, if I'm correct, the writing of John Paul II in the theology of the body was a very long book. I don't have it physically, but I believe it was like 700 and some pages. It wasn't anything short. And so it's good that Christopher West was able to do what he did by making it into something very understandable. And if people are listening and haven't read that yet, or haven't like watched any of the videos, or don't know a ton about it, I mean, my goodness, at this point in time, there's so much out there. So just be sure to check out the Theology of the Body Institute, Christopher West. And, you know, not just Christopher West, because I know that a lot of other authors have also tackled theology of the body, but go right to the source, to Pope John Paul II, and think about checking it out of the library or your church library, or even buying it if you wish. But thank you for all that you shared, Mickey. And, you know, our foundation, you're right. I want to also address what you said about the World Meeting of Families, because if it wasn't for Pope John Paul II, honestly, we might not exist, as Mickey said, because that's exactly how we were formed. It was when the friars, our friars, the Mercedarians, went to that world meeting. The Holy Spirit was really knocking on the door of their hearts and saying, we need to do something to help families. And they specifically picked families in crisis, which are you, our audience, the people listening to this podcast, letting you know that that's what we're attempting to do. We're attempting to make that pastoral outreach. So there's just so much about John Paul II and about his quotes and a lot of the things that he said. Another thing that he said is that as the family goes, so goes the nation, and so goes the world in which we live. Mickey, let's talk about that.
You know what's funny, Ian? I was going to talk about that quote, but, you know, it's a good thing you reminded me. So I'm glad we're like kind of tag teaming on this one. And I think I was kind of alluding to the fact how, you know, I think in order for society to survive, you need strong families. You know, you need the strong love of the man and a woman. And let's face it, you know, marriage is under attack, whether we believe it or not, by the LGBT community, by the mainstream media. It's under attack because the devil knows that when traditional marriage thrives, it is a powerful force to be reckoned with. And let's face it, with strong marriages will make society thrive. When the husband and wife love each other unconditionally as much as their kids, at the same time leading them to heaven. Meanwhile, you know, you have this whole LGBTQ, you know, wherever other letters of the alphabet are in that, and they want to, you know, go after young children at a young age to indoctrinate them. You also have, you know, the secular schools who are corrupt, and you also have mainstream media, you know, portraying families like they're irrelevant, you know, men being wimps, women being stronger than men, which that actually draws a red flag in my opinion, I mean, let's face it, women have their limits just as much as men do. But I think the problem is we need to see how God designed each and every person and what characteristics and traits man and woman can bring to the table. And let's face it too, feminism, and I'm sure you remember this quite well too. I mean, when it was the advent of this movement, it has destroyed families, whether we believe it, whether we believe it or not. And this whole thing that, women are equal to men, that's false. Because let's face it, we need to reclaim the fact that family, traditional family between man and woman, is what we need. And we need to portray what a family should be without causing any kind of confusion.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Men and women are equal in dignity, right? But but they're complementary to each other because they're different. So in terms of in the Lord's eyes, we know that their dignity is the same, right? God looks upon them both with a profound dignity for both men and women. And so thanks for those reflections, because, John Paul II had so much love of the family. And I think really, honestly, I think that was probably his main charism, to be honest with you. One other thing that he said is the great danger for family life in the midst of any society whose idols are pleasure, comfort, and independence lies in the fact that people close their hearts and become selfish. And, I think this quote really, it lended itself to what he did with the theology of the body, doesn't it? Because he says at the end, people close their hearts and become selfish. And that's what we've seen over the last 50 years, I think, with the onset of when abortion, of course, was legalized. And of course, we're seeing many changes now, as Mickey alluded to when he just spoke over this last year. And we pray and hope that hearts will be open to life completely from conception all the way up until natural death. That's what the Catholic Church is all about. And that's what John Paul II was all about. So another one that he said, which he's had so many different quotes, are not to have fear. And this one quote that I'm reading that says, have no fear in moving into the unknown. Simply step out fearlessly, knowing that I'm with you. Therefore, no harm can befall you. All is very, very well. Do this in complete faith and confidence. One of his most famous quotes, and I would say maybe even his famous quote, was "Be not afraid." Let's talk about that.
Well, and honestly, the Catholic Church is under attack, and the anti-Catholic bigotry is alive and well, particularly when we look at the article from the Atlantic that attacks the devotion to the Rosary. And St. John Paul II, by the way, was very devoted to it. In fact, 20 years ago, back in 2002, he even installed the luminous mysteries that we know today, because he knew that, and there were some attempts, by the way, to do it in the past, but it fell through for whatever reason. I think it's something that we have to really, what I honestly, like, when I think of this, is that, St. John Paul II, he was very ahead of his time, because he knew that we were going to endure a lot of persecutions, and it was going to be more extreme than the attacks on Catholics when they first came to the United States, the attacks, from the Protestant Reformation, because there are people that claim to be Catholic, but it's in name only. And I'm not just talking about politicians. I'm talking about people that were once brought up into the faith, but somehow just fell away because they thought, you know what, I don't need this anymore. And they probably come to Mass maybe twice a year, like Easter and Christmas. Or they probably just turned their faith during difficult times, when it should be 365 days a year. And St. John Paul II, and let's also face it too, you may not realize it, but be not afraid is reiterated 365 times in the Bible, Old and New Testament combined, even the epistles. So St. John Paul II knew very well to be not afraid, to open the doors wide to Christ. Do not abandon ourselves to despair, because hallelujah is our song. And let's face it, we Catholics are the Easter people. And we bring hope to a culture of despair.
Thank you for bringing up about the Easter people, because that is absolutely one that he's quoted and he said, and that means that we're resurrection people too, doesn't it? And back to that theology of the body, it's that resurrection not only of the soul but the body too, right? And so that's an interesting thing that he pulled all of that together. Easter people that we are. And there's just so much to talk about when we think about Pope John Paul II. I mean, I would say too, there's a real devotion amongst very devoted Catholics these days to him, especially friends and people who are devoted to the Latin Mass. I've seen that myself, and he's making a difference in their lives and in the lives of others. A lot of his charisms, and as I keep going back to that whole study and understanding of the theology of the body. And so it's just a beautiful thing. Now, of course, before we end every podcast, we have to talk about our services and who we are, because we get new listeners all the time. Is that we are the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. We offer prayer, priestly consultations, podcasts, and programs. You can learn about us at nonnatus.org. May I ask you also, please, to subscribe to all of our channels on social media, because we're on Facebook, we are on Instagram, we are on Twitter, we're even on Snapchat, and we're on LinkedIn. So look us up at St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation and find out more. And please do go to our website and click on subscribe to our mailing list, because we would love to stay in touch with you about great events that are happening. Now, this podcast is being aired at the end of October in 2022. And I just want to mention real quickly, if I could, something very beautiful that we're doing at the end of this year, December 6th, 7th, and 8th, is a Eucharistic Summit online with Patchwork Heart Ministry and Fiat Ministry Network. We're going to have over 30 Catholic authors and speakers giving talks on the beauty of the Eucharist, especially as all over the country and all over the world, there's a revival for the Eucharist right now. And so, of course, we want to get in on that and reach out specifically to families in crisis about the Eucharistic Summit. Because, you know, all of us have times in our lives when we lack in faith. And so that's what this Eucharistic Summit is all about. It's for people just like you. Please go to our website at nonnatus.org under programs or under our services and register for free to this online summit. I'm very excited about this summit. So thank you all so much. I also like to read another quote from John Paul II. He says, "The future is in your hearts and in your hands. God is entrusting to you the task, at once difficult and uplifting of working with him in the building of the civilization of love." And that was a word that he used quite often, wasn't it, Mickey? Let's talk about that before we end.
He sure has. And in fact, I remember Carl Anderson, he wrote a book called The Civilization of Love. And that's actually based around the quote of St. John Paul the Great. And he actually inspired the Culture Project. And I'm sure they're listening to this podcast episode. Ed and I have a tradition on this on the podcast episodes that we're going to give shout outs every so often to organizations, that we are proud to support from time to time. And also, they're doing great, and also those that are doing great things. So Culture Project, this shout out's for you. So I hope you really enjoyed this episode. If not, you tell us privately. But anyway, to unpack it a little bit, Anne, I think what St. John Paul the Great has seen is that he saw that how he was loved by his parents, how they unconditionally served him and his kids, his siblings, I should rather say, and taught them what unconditional love was and how authentic it was. At the same time, St. John Paul the Great even showered the world with that love to so many people, whether it was papal pilgrimages like World Youth Day or the World Meet of Families, or even general audiences, his writings, his encyclicals. And today, his legacy lives in so many, because St. John Paul the Great related to the youth, and he even guided the church into the 21st century. And he wants us to stand firm. He wants us to have, to paraphrase one of his quotes, is to have a wonderful adventure with Christ in our lives. He wants us to have hope, to stop a nation from killing its children. He wants us to love one another, whether it's our spouses, our family, or even our friends, unconditionally like Jesus did. He wants us to make our fellow humans fully alive with our love. Even St. John Paul II knew that his response, the response that we should have with all the hatred in the world, because he grew up in two different occupations. One was Nazism during World War II, and at the dawn of the Cold War, communism. He didn't just preach it, he lived it. And he wasn't afraid to set an example to what a loving, holy father should be.
Yes, what a loving, holy father he was. Now, we're coming almost to a close, but you were going to mention also about the canonization, the possible canonization of his parents. Talk a little bit about that before we end.
Sure, Anne. So 2 years ago, the Vatican, along with the Archdiocese of Krakow, which is in Poland, has opened the call for canonization for the parents of St. John Paul the Great. And they are Karol Wojtyła, which is St. John Paul II's father's name. And by the way, that's the Pope's name, Karol Wojtyła Jr. And his mother is Emilia. And they, this actually was started on May 7th, which was the feast, on May 7th. And I think the cause is still open at this time. So we pray that, something will give. And let's face it, if St. Teresa's parents can be canonized, and let's face it too, sainthood is not just for the religious, it's for everyone. And even St. John Paul the Great, he launched he oversaw some canonizations of lay people, not in addition to some religious, and even some causes for canonization for people. And I think some of them were completed between Pope Benedict XVI and as well as Pope Francis. And let's face it, folks, there is a growing number of causes for canonization for lay Catholics. So we are in good company, and the standards are high. And parents, Look to the example of St. John Paul II's parents, let alone St. Teresa's parents. And yes, you can look to your spouse and say, hey, I want to lead you and the kids to heaven. Let's do it.
Thank you for sharing that information, especially about their possible canonization. And I just want to end the podcast with a special prayer that was actually one that was said on Easter Sunday, March 27th of 2005. And I believe that was before he passed away. And the
Just
prayer
days
is
before, yeah.
Yeah, the prayer is Jesus crucified and risen, stay with us. Stay with us, faithful friend and sure support for humanity on its journey through history. Living word of the Father, give hope and trust to all who are searching for the true meaning of their lives. Bread of eternal life, nourish those who hunger for truth, freedom, justice, and peace. Amen. And Mickey, thank you for joining us on this podcast. Now, everyone, we will be back again next month for our Families in Crisis podcast that premieres at 8 p.m. the last Thursday of every month. But good news, it's on demand, so you can click to subscribe on YouTube at Philly Nonnatus, and every time we have a new podcast, you'll get a little notification on your phone or on your computer. So, Mickey, thank you so much again.
And thank you for having me.
God bless everyone. We'll see you right here next month with the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith 10 Saints podcast. See you then.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more information about the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation, visit nonnatus.org or email director.srnf@gmail.com.
The Shroud of Turin is one of the most researched and studied relics in church history, and profoundly impacts many who encounter its mystery.
As a person of faith, looking at it through the eyes of faith, I don't think it can help but touch your heart.
Something that we can look on not only to bolster our faith in those moments of weakness, but also to deepen our faith and our appreciation, our intimacy with Christ.
Join Fiat Ministry Network and Patchwork Heart Ministry as they examine the science of the shroud through the lens of faith.
Really interesting scientific information that we didn't know about, like the pollen from all the different regions of the world. As the shroud traveled around, it picked that up. Some of the mites, things like that was really interesting to me. I mean, this made you really want to believe it a lot more.
It's impressive. Like, humanly, I don't think that is another level of love. It's not I'm like, oh, I love you, I'll give you a chocolate. No. I'm giving you more than my life. I'm giving you my suffering.
Asking both experts and disciples, who do you say I am?
As far as who the man of the shroud is, as a person of faith and kind of reviewing the evidence there, it seems that a convincing argument can be made that it's Jesus of Nazareth.
Visit patchworkheart.org/shroud to learn more and get exclusive behind-the-scenes updates for your support.